Alright, welcome to my first movie review for TUSK. I am V for verbatim, named V for verbatim because everything I've said has been said before in 1,000 ways, in 1,000 words, some in the same 4 chords. I'm going to be starting off by saying I wouldn't recommend this movie to everyone. Not because I think it isn't a decent movie, it's kind of a mixed bag, and I'm going to say that a lot, but because of what happens in it is genuinely horrifying. It's the worst kind of torture I think I've seen in any horror movie so far that I've seen. I mean, I've seen the basic psychological and physical torture in movies like Saw and It and Nightmare on Elm Street kind of stuff, but this just combines both in such a brutal way that I don't think everyone could stomach it easily. It's a lot. So I think if you haven't watched it, but you want to watch it, definitely go in with the mindset that things are going to get messed up really quick, and you just got to kind of strap in and accept it's going to happen. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's move on to a little bit of production info. This movie was made in 2014 by the director Kevin Smith. He's done work as a director in the past and even currently. He actually discussed the idea for the movie on a podcast with a friend. They came across this random story about a person that was basically offering free rooming to whoever picked up the advertisement as long as they dressed up as a walrus for several hours a day. And being a creator, Kevin Smith spent an hour discussing how intricate that would have to be and basically creating the movie on the podcast. And he actually left it up to supporters to decide whether or not he'd make the actual movie. And it's a really interesting and really cool example, actually, of the audience determining what was produced, because it did end up being made, so obviously people wanted it made. And it's really because of normal people and because of the audience that it was made. And it's just an interesting story. So the movie was made, obviously. It was originally going to be made by Blumhouse, but A24 actually picked it up, and it does have traces of very definitely Blumhouse-y in certain ways. Like, it seems like it could be relatively cheap to make. There aren't many locations or anything. Not a lot of actors involved. Definitely a cheap but like a decent story, very characters, like a decent amount of Blumhouse movies. And being cheap isn't a problem. It's just something I noticed. And then it was also originally going to be called The Walrus and the Carpenter, because I think that's what the name of the podcast episode was. But they ended up shortening it to a single name title, TUSK, like other movies of that time, like really vague 1 or 2 word titles like Get Out or Us, or if you want to leave the realm of horror, Tangled, Frozen, that kind of stuff. Definitely Disney kind of thing. So yeah, just a lot of interesting information leading up to the actual creation of the movie. Okay, so you probably want to know what the movie's about, so we're just going to dive right in. Basically, it's about these 2 guys that host a podcast called the Not See Party, and I'm going to say it like that so you don't think it's the other one. And it's a pretty popular podcast about these 2 guys that make fun of kids on the internet for doing stupid things. Can't imagine anybody, any groups, not even the art and drama community, making fun of people for stuff like that. Who would do such a thing? The 2 guys, their names are Wallace and Teddy. And if you have half a brain cell, you probably know which one's going to become a walrus by the end of the movie. Wallace and Teddy, just leave it there, let you figure it out. They start off the movie by, there's this kid called Kill Bill Kid, and he lost a leg because he was playing around with a sword, because they just laugh at his expense, because what's funnier than a kid that can never live out his figure skating dreams? The guy, Wallace, the guy that's not going to become a walrus, plans to go to Manitoba, Canada, to visit Kill Bill Kid. And basically interview him for the podcast. And so it's kind of, when he's there, it's a very mixed, hilarious, some cliche, some loud American shenanigans ensue kind of stuff. The opening scene with that stuff is with the customs, definitely iconic. 100% will quote the lines from that scene in my daily life now. Just a lot of lines like, Canadians aren't nice, they're just optimistic, and they're optimistic and tolerant. And it was funny, but it was very well played, and it wasn't overly done like some of the later stuff. Wallace eventually goes and finds out the Kill Bill Kid. He finds his family at his funeral because he decided to commit seppuku, because the most honorable way to die in the face of defeat. And it was a questionable punchline, because I knew that what they were going for was something funny. But because it was at a funeral, and it was just like, Usually you can play that for laughs if you do the right things beforehand, but it felt like they played it too straight. I don't know. It could have been funny, but it was just a little questionable at that point. Either way, Wallace and Gromit don't have a show anymore, and their trip to Manitoba, Canada was a $500 bust. Wallace has nothing to do now. So he goes to a bar, he sees basically a page out of Moby Dick on the wall where a man named Howard Howe offers a free place to stay and stories. So I guess he takes him up on the offer. Wallace makes the trip up to Mr. Howe's mansion, a boot 2 hours away, as the kids in the convenience store say. And let me just say for a second that this part of the movie between Wallace and Mr. Howe, just these two characters just talking, it's arguably my favorite part of the movie, without any walruses involved. This just feels like a very character-driven moment, and I love that stuff. There's clearly something up with Howe, but it's like you can tell there's something off in the way he speaks. Or the guy they chose was a native-born Canadian actor. He's a veteran of the industry, but he just acted the shit out of this scene. And it's just like he's telling stories about D-Day, meeting Ernest Hemingway left and right, and it's talking about walrus appendages, and it's just like, you feel so engaged and drawn in, like me and several other people who were watching. Definitely, we were all engaged and listening in. It felt like the world disappeared, basically. And it was great. And not only that, but the house itself is also telling the story. There's all these artifacts and photos on the wall. The best way I can describe it is an intricately woven web, which I think makes sense because the true intentions of Howe, because he's the villain. Spoiler alert for an 8-year-old movie, but it's like a web, and he's created this web of lies. Again, another spoiler. A lot of it is definitely dishonest and it's just, that's one of the issues with that. It's like, it's a really well put together scene. Everything is just really well done, and you really feel like you're in the scene. But in hindsight, none of it matters except a couple of the elements of the stories. It's a missed opportunity, I think. It's really, they kind of undid they unraveled the web they made. And it's a shame, but I definitely still enjoyed that part of the movie, even knowing what happens later. And we're going to be getting to that. Okay, so either way, we get into the thick of this story. Howard tells about the story about being lost at sea and being saved by a walrus he calls Mr. Tusk. He talks about Mr. Tusk, and he leaves out a few important details for later. So Wallace ends up passing out after all these stories in this really, really well put together scene. And because he was drugged by Howard. And he wakes up, and Howard Howe tells him that he was bitten by a brown recluse. Because, in Canada. I actually looked it up. They don't even exist outside the southern United States. Not even in, like, Australia, where everything wants to kill you. Brown recluses are bad, but they don't live in Australia. But they don't live anywhere near Canada. So that's a pretty bad lie to start out with. And it just gets worse, because he says that Wallace's leg had to be removed because of the venom, and then the doctor came by but isn't there anymore, and that his phone is broken, and that Howe doesn't have a phone, and that there's probably no phones in like a 3-mile radius. And it's just like, bro, you dug yourself into a hole the second you brought up the freaking spider. It's just great. Even as like the story starts to kind of unravel and derail and stuff, it feels like it's derailing with purpose. So I'll just take a second here to bring up that there's also these periodical flashbacks to Wallace and his girlfriend Allie. So Wallace, basically, while he's been working on this podcast, he's kind of become this different person, and he's kind of been cheating on his girlfriend while off on like trips to interview people for the podcast. Despite Allie being super hot and probably the best thing he has in his life, Allie has also been sleeping with his friend Teddy behind his back. And there's this discussion of like he has with his girlfriend, where it's like he talks about the old Wallace versus the new Wallace, the new successful Wallace, and it really brings up this theme of transformation. It's kind of throughout the movie, and it's really well done here. The more I think about it, the more it's like everything feels very intricate, very purposeful, and it's really nice to see. Even if this movie, it can be a mess at places. All right. So anyway, Wallace tries to call for help because, like the audience, he knows that Howe is being super sus at this point, like basically seeing and venting. So Hal outright reveals himself to be the imposter by standing up out of his wheelchair that he's been sitting in this whole time to bitch slap Wallace for yelling for help. And it's just a great moment because right after, turns back around, doesn't say a word, sits back in the wheelchair like a boss. And it's great. And then he decides to reveal his plans to put Wallace into a walrus suit, a literal walrus suit. And Wallace rightfully doesn't want that. Doesn't even know how bad it's going to be yet. Like, if he knew, he doesn't want that. So he eventually does find his phone, because his phone's obviously not broken. And he calls for Allie and Teddy so that they can come find him. But Hal knocks him out again, and basically begins the assimilation process of like sewing these bits and pieces of human skin onto Wallace, taking out his femur bones to put them in his face so that they can be the tusks. You don't see all of it yet. It's very purposeful in the fact that it's not showing the complete transformation. You just see all this blood and tissues and stuff everywhere, and it's just like all this stuff, and it just makes things horrifying later. Meanwhile, Teddy and Allie receive Wallace's messages, and like good friends, they actually decide to come looking for him because they realize he's not messing around. It's interesting to see that Teddy and Allie, like, she's cheating on Wallace behind his back, but he still actually she still looks out for him. They try to figure out what they can with the Canadian police, and Wallace conveniently left out Hal's address for some reason. He left it out in his panic, and so the police have very little to work with. And even worse, they find out that Howard Howe faked his name, and so he can't be found. No address, they don't even have a name. And that's when this movie goes from good to great, because Johnny goddamn Depp just shows up based as a Quebec version of L from Death Note, who has been hunting down a serial killer using nothing but his French accent and no-nonsense jabs. It's beautiful. He meets up with Teddy and Allie, and he calls Howe the first wife because he destroys the bodies of the victims and doesn't let them speak by cutting out their tongues, but he never does anything sex related to them. And then he explains how he did meet Howe before once, but he made a poor judgment call. He thought he was like some random Canadian dude, and didn't actually check inside his house, knowing that a victim was missing. And the victim was probably inside the house, and he had to look into the eyes of the victim's mother, tell her that like he couldn't save her son. And it's definitely perfect motivation for this movie, for this character that basically comes in the last 20 minutes, but just Johnny Depp. It's all so fantastic. They're retracing his steps, and just Johnny Depp is just being his chaotic self for the last 20 minutes of the movie, helping them find this missing guy that's been turned into a walrus. That's when I realized, I don't think this movie's serious. Like, it's not serious. This movie is horrifying. The longer you think about it, it's just like, it's horrible. And everyone involved is gonna suffer after this. The longer you think about the implications. But then, the less you think about it, and the more you think, this movie is about a guy that's turned into a walrus and a Quebec detective coming after him. And it's like, oh, well, maybe it isn't that serious. So while those three meddling kids are off doing their thing in the weirdest episode of Scooby-Doo ever, the most terrific part of the movie is finally come into play. Wallace is basically a mass of sewn together skin and bones, and he very much resembles a walrus. So he's got all this skin sewn onto him. His tongue's been cut out. He's got these tusks stuck in his face, dragging all of this weight around, all this mass, this extra fat and tissue and stuff, dragging that around, knowing that he can't ever live a real life anymore because he's stuck as this thing that's not even a walrus. It's just he's a walrus in shape now, but not just any walrus, the walrus, because you see, Hal had a tragic backstory, and he's been lying about all of his stories that made the first scene with him so great. In actuality, he was taken in by an orphanage, and that orphanage became a mental asylum where he was physically and sexually abused and tormented by his caretakers. And the one somewhat true story that he told was the one about Mr. Tusk, but to survive after being saved by Mr. Tusk, Hal had to eat and kill him. So now he's turned Wallace into Mr. Tusk, and he's done it multiple times before. He's killed a bunch of people. That's why Johnny Quebec is after him. So he's turned him into Mr. Tusk so that he can relive the event and give Mr. Tusk a chance to kill him and live. And this whole motivation, it could have been handled so much better. It feels a little too teenage horror OC with a tragic backstory to me. It's interesting to see Hal and Wallace both losing their minds from the trauma they're forced to endure and just like breaking each other down through their own slow deteriorating sanity. But it could have been executed so much better. But there is the one bright side, is like the relationship between the two breaking each other down does feel very much like Wallace's relationship to Allie, where they're both cheating on each other, and it's just this horrible situation where they're both becoming worse people and turning to other people for comfort. It feels very much like it's supposed to mirror that relationship, and him losing that old side of himself. And I guess he lost his self when he got fame, but he lost his physical self when he and Hal met each other. It's just interesting to see those parallels. So Wallace at this point has been butchered, forced to eat fish and swim with the corpses of Hal's other victims and with Hal himself, and he believes that nobody's coming to help him. There's just all these layers and layers of suffering, and he can't escape any of it. So at the end, the climax of the movie is just, it's great. It's fantastic. It's Hal himself enters a second walrus skin, and he initiates a battle as climactic as Infinity War. Or it could have been if it had been longer than 3 minutes. Wallace stabs Hal to death with his tusks in about 5 seconds. It's not even cinematically interesting. Like, there's no cool camera angle or like humanity is evil or like cool cliche moments like that. He stabs him to death with his tusks. Wallace kills him. He does that right as Johnny Quebec and his friends show up. Honestly, they were too late to save him the second that Wallace called him, because he was already being turned into the walrus. He's lost his mind from this experience. His body isn't his. He can't even function as a human being because of like all of the physical torture that's been done to him. And now that he's killed Hal, Wallace is the walrus. To quote a Beatles song, he is the walrus. Boop boop a choo. He was gone. He's just gone. And so Wallace the walrus looks up at his friends and doesn't see them. His friends look back at him in horror, and they don't see him either. They just see this mass of flesh, and to spare both his friends and Wallace, Johnny Depp ends up shooting him to just end the suffering. Except nope, because we get an even worse, horrible, miserable ending where Allie and Teddy come to visit Wallace at a zoo where they feed him raw fish. It's great, and it's horrible because Allie remembers something she said to Wallace back when they were like still together, back when Wallace was still himself. And she remembers saying to Wallace how everybody should cry because it separates them from the animals. And she cries, and after she and Teddy turn to leave, Wallace himself cries before returning to his walrus self and back to his broken self. And that's where the movie ends. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about my thoughts on the movie. I'm going to be going over this in Canada-do's and Canada-don'ts to quote this god-awful ending of a movie. So we're going to start with some positives. A couple of things. Opening scene in Canada with the customs guy feels iconic even on the first watch. Like, I'm probably going to use those lines somewhere in my life now. It's just, the dialogue in this movie is on point at parts. Also, the opening scene with the villain, with Hal, with him in the house talking about Hemingway and all this stuff. It was just amazing to watch. It felt like improv, and the actor acted the shit out of that scene, and I'm probably going to think of that scene as one of the top scenes I've seen in a horror movie in a while. Also, another thing, the main three, the podcasters, Teddy and Wallace, and Allie they felt very fleshed out and surprisingly well developed. Nobody's innocent. Everybody's in a gray area. They're not deep character-wise, but it just, like, I love just seeing characters interact in a way that's just, it's I like seeing characters that aren't all douche. Like, I like douche characters, but I like when there's a little bit more nuance. And I feel like this movie did that for me. And another thing, Johnny Depp in this movie was like adding sprinkles to a sundae, because it was not necessary, but it was welcome. I don't know if that's controversial to say. I don't know what the whole thing with Johnny Depp is at the moment, but just his part in the movie was just brilliant. Even if it felt a little out of place. Another thing, movie again was hilarious at points, even if they weren't appropriate, but I love twisted jokes and dark humor, definitely where it's at. It's just, it needed to be placed a little bit better. Like, there's a few scenes, like the reveal of the walrus suit. There was this weird zoom out that felt like it was from a Japanese commercial, that weird corniness. Not a fan of that. And then the whole thing with the funeral and the Bill Kill kid. It was just the beginning, but it felt very out of place. Another thing, the protagonist's fate was horrible and like beautiful. It was brilliant, and they were unlikable. Like, he was unlikable, but at the same time, like, it was tragic and painful, because you could see the pain it caused everybody. It wasn't just him. It was Allie, it was Teddy. Just seeing all of them, seeing him, and like, it affected everybody. So even though I didn't necessarily like Wallace himself, like, I could feel the pain from everybody else. And then another thing, like I said before, I love this theme of transformation, where he starts out like this normal guy, but it becomes terrible. He loses himself because of success and becomes this new self, this new Wallace. And then he's again forced to become something new on the outside. From how? He lost his self, and then he loses his like physical self. And then it takes becoming that animal for him to re-find his humanity at the end, when he does cry in response to Ali's sadness. And another, less sad and less thought-provoking, but practical effects, top-notch. At least the skin suit. The walrus skin suit was horrifying to look at. It made me squirm. Definitely unsettling and perfect for this movie. Right, so now I'm going to talk about some can of don'ts. First of all, the intro with Hal was not as impactful in hindsight. Many of the stories he made up and helped characterize him were lies, and it was hard to sympathize with him afterwards. It's the same thing with like twist villains, where you learn all this stuff about who they were, and then you take that all away for this kind of cheap twist kind of thing, and it takes away from the character that they were before, which may or may not have actually been a good character. It's a shame, because I really loved those opening minutes with him. And another thing, the ending, I really liked to see the relationship between the characters after everything had happened, but it's kind of nitpicky, because this movie is not realistic and not trying to be realistic, but just leaving Wallace to suffer as a walrus, it felt really unrealistic. And another nitpick, the flesh collected to make the walrus suit, I'm not sure if you all know this, but skin tends to rot when it's not on the body anymore. Like, I mean, he could have put it in a fridge or a freezer or something to preserve it, but like, I think after like a few days, that stuff should have been smelling nasty, and it should have been like blackened and gangrenous and stuff. It's not realistic. Another thing, podcasters felt a little too unlikable at points. Like the whole Americans in Canada thing could have been less cliche and underplayed. It could have been lessened a little bit. And another thing, the whole, a lot of this is just mostly about messages and overall. The whole humanity is evil message from How has been so overused at this point. And this movie was made in 2014, so I'll give it that. But at the same time, the humanity is evil thing has been overdone with like monster movies and all this kind of stuff, where we were the bad guys all along. It's getting kind of old and exhausted. It's a tired cliche at this point. Another thing, Hal loses momentum during the end. He starts out as this really intriguing mystery character, but then he just kind of fizzles out really quick at the boss battle when he dies in 5 seconds. It's great, fantastic, 10 out of 10. Another thing, the podcaster Teddy and the girlfriend coming after Wallace probably should have been started earlier in the movie. Like, I think how it could have been done is rearrange the flashbacks with the Wallace and Allie Wallace and his girlfriend, have those at the beginning, so that she's established. There's all this stuff established earlier on. Throw in like the whole podcast scene where they're talking about the Kill Bill kid later, so that it can kind of establish them to be douchebags, basically, as well as establish his relationship to Allie, and then have Teddy and Allie going after Wallace a little earlier so that they're more proactive characters. They just felt more like they didn't feel as important to the plot when they could have, and they probably should have. Another thing, some of the shots felt a little corny. Again, the walrus suit reveal, not a fan. And then I think last thing, it's a pretty minor thing actually, but the music probably could have been a bit more memorable. I don't remember much about like the tone of the movie, which is very much established by the music. I felt like it could have used a little bit more memorable music cues and stuff. And I'm like a sucker for music, so that's just a personal preference. Now, how would I rate this movie? So I've told you my positives and negatives for this movie. I have them all listed, and I've looked over them, and I'm probably gonna rate the movie based on how many, like the ratio of one over the other. So there's about the same amount per positive and negative, but I have a few in negative that I think are a little bit nitpicky and weren't as important as the things that I found that were fun and like good and decent. So I think I'd rate this as a 6.5 out of 10, just to be, because I enjoyed it watching it and just kind of got nitpicky towards actually reviewing it. I really enjoyed the dark humor and characters, but some things just didn't work in hindsight, and there are some inconsistencies in the humor-horror combination. Overall, I had a good time with this one, and I can't wait for the sequel where Teddy becomes a bear. Hi, I just wanted to thank everybody that made it this far. I wanted to thank you all for watching. This is my first big video, so I'm going to be keep working to improve the quality and content wise. You probably noticed all the cuts and the ums and the basicallys. Probably noticed all of that. Me filling space, basically. I'm going to be going by a script next time, so hopefully that'll be cutting down on the cuts and the ums. You probably noticed I use a voice changer, but if the quality does suffer, then I will probably use my real voice. I really just want this to be about quality for you guys. And you could probably be expecting in the future from this channel, this one might take a little while, maybe like a month or so, maybe more than a month. I don't know yet how scheduling is going to work, but I plan to make a character retrospective based on the characters that I've drawn over, I think it's 10 years at this point. It's going to be a lot. There's space hamsters, there are astrocorns, there are fire lions, there's a lot of stuff. But closer to now, you could be expecting a Willy's Wonderland review, if you've ever heard of that movie. A lot of the movie reviews get struck down because of copyright, but I plan to not use a lot of footage from the movies, just to have more fun editing-wise. If you noticed, I was having a little bit too much fun with editing. So, I plan to keep building this up and to have fun with you guys. So I hope your day goes well. Hope I didn't keep you too long, and just have a great day, or at least just find something nice about today. If not this video, definitely not this video, but try to find something nice about this day and just keep going if you're having a hard time today.